Hey, welcome to A Foreigner in the Philippines. Well, this is the introduction to another story that came about because I was thinking in a certain vein. And when you're a writer, or you're trying to be a writer, or you're writing short stories, then the important thing is to be observing what is happening in your daily life. How do people behave? How do they react when they're in a certain situation? Do all people respond or react in the same way? Well, of course they don't. And you can see this if you've watched Clint Eastwood in, say, Every Which Way But Loose. In one particular case, he's in a bar and he leans over to the bar to grab a handful of peanuts. He does it a couple of times, and the guy that's sitting in front of the peanut bowl doesn't like it. And from there, my light has gone out again. And from there's a fight. The bar's destroyed, and that was Clint Eastwood, who was the hero, or the anti-hero. That was how he responded to a given situation. Well, I then began to think of how life is in a British pub. And in this particular case, it's set in a pub called the Pig and Whistle. Is there such a place as the Pig and Whistle? I have no idea. What would a pig be doing with a whistle? Maybe that's another story. But I thought, who would the characters be in such a story? And so then I thought up the idea of a man who considered himself to be very handsome, even though other people didn't always think that he was, but apparently the ladies did, and his nickname was Pretty Boy Eddie. And so I liked that name, and I came up with that. Now, the hero of the story, or the main character, the person who is narrating the story, is never named. He's just the observer for what happened. And well, I won't give away all of it, but the main characters, Pretty Boy Eddie and his girlfriend, and the narrator's sister, who is of course Mavis, and the mother. And the mother is a terrifying character because she is she's the Clint Eastwood she's the Clint Eastwood of the story, who doesn't mess about at all, and she's as tough as any guy. So that's how it all comes together. So I hope you enjoy it. And this is and the title of this is called Hands Off Our Mavis, and it all happens in the north of England. So there's that kind of atmosphere and accent. Thanks a lot. Enjoy. Hands Off Our Mavis by Terence Flannery. So I still say things were going just great till Pretty Boy Eddie waltzed in the door of the Pig and Whistle with that fancy piece of his and started straight in on our Mavis. Now, we all know our Mavis is no great beauty. Okay, not even that attractive. Fine, so she struggles even to be plain. Happy now? Does that give Eddie the right to do as he pleases with her? I don't think so, sweetheart. And you know what? I don't know where he got that name from anyway, 'cause when you take into account that Pretty Boy Eddie ain't no prettier than you and me,
You can see that him strutting around doing his Gary Cooper lacks a certain credibility. So what if he's seen High Noon 37 times? I've seen Dirty Harry 43 times. Do I keep asking you to make my day, punk? Well, I wasn't about to just stand there watching him trying to undress my sister as if I wasn't even in the room, as if my head's buttoned up the back. Want to know how to take a man down in one? Listen and learn, honey. A well-placed kidney punch is as good as any. Now, it's best delivered from behind, which some would say is sneaky. But hey, this is not Hollywood, and I'm not Rocky Balboa. Life ain't fair, sweetheart, so that's how the pretty boy got his. This placed him on his knees and perfectly positioned for my Doc Martens special edition Chelsea boot, placed with surgical precision right to his family jewels. Now, I'm not a man who is easily surprised, so as for what happened next, well, you could have knocked me down with a beer crate, which coincidentally is exactly what Pretty Boy Eddie's fancy piece up and did, and with a wooden beer crate at that. Now I ask you, was that fair? We were fighting it out man to man. Okay, I admit I had that small advantage and maybe should have waited till Eddie was looking before I hit him from behind. However, you could say that was instant karma, as he was doing his thing and fastened onto our Mavis's face at the time. And you know what? Now I think of it, she didn't seem to be objecting an awful lot. So, it turns out that the fancy piece was handier with a beer crate than any bartender I ever knew, and more forgiving in some ways, as she helped me to my feet before she threw that positively vicious left hook. Fortunately for me, she missed the mark and wrapped her arm around my neck. She ended up right in close, and my head got buried for a moment in her chest. Now, I'm a leg man myself, but even in the heat of the moment, I clearly remember thinking, boy, this woman is built. This is probably the exact moment that her knee came hurtling up, sharp and fast, and cruelly so, and arrived at the tender pelvic junction between my legs. Now, isn't pain a funny thing? Well, okay, not a laugh-out-loud funny thing, but it does have a way of making you focus in the moment, as that Buddha fella and his gang of bedsheet warriors would say, and certainly the fancy piece now had all my attention. You know how things look when the room is spinning around and you're swimming in a sea of pain? Well, okay, you probably don't, sweetheart, so just use your imagination. Here's where my acute sense of irony, which I have been complimented on many times, comes in. I peered through the veil of agony, and if I had been physically able to do so, I would have gasped in amazement at what I saw. Pretty Boy Eddie and me are both enjoying the same crippling injury, but I lie alone and ignored, while Eddie has the undivided attention of both the fancy piece and, yes, you've got it, sunshine, our bloody Mavis, for crying out loud. Pretty Boy is lying curled up like a big prawn in the fetal position, clutching his jennies, which are still on fire if his are anything like mine, and sounds like he is positively crooning about the pain like Bing frigging Crosby. The two women are singing out their sympathy, and in two-part harmony is how it seemed to me. Now, help me out here, will you? Did I miss something? I mean, just take a look at what happened. Pretty boy Eddie crashed our party with the fancy piece in tow, and did no more than immediately make for our Mavis for a cheap grope. And Fancy didn't seem to mind one bit, don't you know. In the sharpest of contrast, my mother, who at the time was winning an arm-wrestling match against Benny the Bull, took on an expression of extreme displeasure that was about as subtle as a Sherman tank. Be informed, sweetheart. You don't want to make my mummy mad. You won't like my mummy when she's mad. Bearing that in mind, and only in the spirit of keeping the peace, I sidled over to Eddie and Mavis and slipped Eddie the kidney punch and the nutcracker, after which I stepped back to savour a quick victory. Enter the fancy piece, and vengeance was hers, and Lord, was it ever. When I eventually hit the floor, I was clutching my nether regions and wondering how much was left of my bits and pieces. Tables, chairs, and people scattered as my mother, who was already in a mood, due to breaking in a new pair of G.I. Joe steel-capped work boots, cut a path through the room as she stomped her way over to me with a face as black as Harry Belafonte. Never one to mince words, she grated through furiously clenched teeth as she sneered down at me. "You big girl's blouse, you let the fancy piece take you down?" Then she dropped a coin in the juke, and as the king warbled his way through Love Me Tender, she walked in perfect time to the music, slowly and almost sensuously, for an old girl, I thought, to where the fancy piece was still honeying over pretty boy Eddie. On the way there, Mummy casually rolled her sleeve over a well-muscled forearm and picked up the discarded beer crate. Oh man, let me tell you, at the end of the most beautifully executed right-hand swing, when the beer crate connected, Fancy Piece flew into orbit without ever knowing what hit her. Darth Vader himself never looked so menacing as my mother must have looked as she towered over the paralysed form of Eddie, who was by now speechless and cringing in a terror of anticipation. He stared up, panic-stricken, at my mother, with his eyes bulging through the fingers of hands curled like claws over his face, and probably praying for a quick and painless death. Mummy stooped down and fixed a vice-like grip round pretty boy Eddie's throat, and as she pulled his face close to hers, she smiled, almost kindly, but her eyes glittered as they narrowed right down to two thin slits. Her fist, which is a whole lot bigger than most guys I know, must have entirely filled his field of vision, pressed as it was hard up against his nose. Through teeth hung with ice, and a voice that dripped with malice, she hissed, "Hands off our Mavis!"